Time is a game played beautifully by children.
Want to come up with the discussion of the use of digital currencies in investment developments by BRICS member states inside the group and also in the interests of other developing and emerging economies with good prospects. And we are to come up with a toolkit that will be under the supervision of the respective BRICS institutions.
Vladimir Putin recently floated the idea of integrating digital currencies into the BRICS platform. Now, whether he means crypto assets specifically or more traditional central bank digital currencies or CBDCs is up for debate. But here's the kicker. Reports keep rolling in that Russia is moving to legalize crypto investments with plans for their sovereign wealth fund to invest in Bitcoin mining equipment. So it's a pretty safe bet that both CBDCs and crypto assets will find a home on BRICS platform. The big question, how to make room for this diverse asset class. It's clear that a neutral protocol is essential to support Bitcoin scaling, enable currency issuance, and facilitate the issuance of tokenized assets like gold and other commodities, all on a single and public ledger. This approach would provide a unified space for the diverse asset classes, ensuring inclusivity, transparency for everyone involved.
That Trump is clearly the more pro-crypto and Bitcoin candidate, and VP Harris has not said a single word on it, so one doubts whether she truly understands it. But to your question about the correlations, the most significant long-term correlations for Bitcoin are a negative correlation with the US dollar and a positive correlation with money supply growth, or M2. So clearly on the latter front, money growth has reaccelerated with the Fed pivot. That may be playing part of a role. Also, some sellers' exhaustion. The German government and the U.S. government sold spitefully $2 billion worth of Bitcoin in the last couple months. That has eased, and I think the election is helping. Polls are helping.
Why'd they do that?
German government seized a couple $1 billion of Bitcoin in a crime and sold it in August because they don't like it.
Because they don't like. You just said spitefully. I wondered why you had that. Is that an adjective or an adverb? I don't know. It's maybe an adverb.
Bitcoin's price has been hanging out near previous all-time highs, despite periodic sell-offs by the U.S. government unloading Silk Road Bitcoin or the German government unloading their Alpha Bay Bitcoin. Rather than dumping it in all one go, the governments are applying steady selling pressure. Yet Bitcoin still holds strong above previous all-time highs. Technically speaking, that's quite a bullish flex from Bitcoin. Two sovereign nations are selling, and Bitcoin is just shrugging it off.
Bitcoin is a chameleon. Its correlations change over time. It's hard to predict what it's going to be correlated with over the short term, over the long term.
But you really say it's because of the 21 million and fixed amount is out there, therefore the debasement of the currency favors that. I mean, that's.
Yeah, it's
Some people call that fairy
it's a
dust.
non-U.S. asset. It's an emerging markets asset. And while we were all hyperventilating about the election over the last week, BRICS had a conference in Russia. There's 6 new members of BRICS this year. So BRICS GDP is now greater than the combined GDP of G7. Of the 6 new members, 3 of them, Argentina, the UAE, and Ethiopia, are now mining Bitcoin with government resources. So there is tremendous urgency outside of the U.S. to find a way to circumvent the irresponsible fiscal policy that we've been running here in the U.S. In fact, Russia announced an initiative there. Sovereign Wealth Fund is going to invest in a regional initiative to build Bitcoin mining and AI infrastructure throughout BRICS with an idea of settling global trade in Bitcoin. So look, someday, I don't know if it's 5 years, 10 years, Putin's going to die. We're going to look to reintegrate some of these countries into the world financial system, and they're going to be trading with Bitcoin. What are we going to be doing?
Did you catch that? He pointed out that BRICS nations now have a combined GDP greater than the G7, which sends a very bullish signal for crypto assets overall. This shift highlights a growing mistrust in the US dollar among these countries, who felt the brunt of centralized sanctions and policies. They're not looking to replace one centralized system with another centralized system, like having China or Russia dictate a new BRICS reserve currency. Instead, they're likely to opt for decentralized assets like gold, silver, crypto, or a mix of all of the above. And from the looks of it, they're ticking every one of those boxes.
$100,000 asset soon, 200.
Yes. The smallest ever trough to peak rally for a Bitcoin cycle was 2,000%. If we do half of that, that'd be 1,000%. That'd be roughly 180,000.
When does this all go down? Not down. When does this
When did
happen?
it all happen?
I think after the election will be a significant catalyst. You can see it front page of the Wall Street Journal talking about debt and deficit concerns.
Right.
Like Moody's is telegraphing this.
Right.
They want to downgrade sovereigns who
Where are you
have
compared to, like Kathy Woods?
What's that?
Like Kathy Wood?
My old boss?
Yeah. How do you feel about her predictions?
I don't think about them very much.
I mean, do you think she's right? 500,000 is where she's at by very soon.
We have a model that assumes that by 2050, this is very long term, that Bitcoin becomes a reserve asset that's used in global trade and held by global central banks at a very modest 2% weight. And in that model, we arrive at a $3 million price target for Bitcoin. Now, that sounds, extreme, but that's a 16% compound annual growth rate for a couple decades. That's not really that extreme. So into the millions over the medium term is a high conviction call.
He's accounting for only 2%. 2% is nothing. If you look at the grand scheme, the BRICS nations are now making up more GDP than the G7 nations. On top of that, if Bitcoin starts going parabolic like he's anticipating, there's going to be other altcoins that benefit from Bitcoin accelerating into growth. Just think about El Salvador that accepted Bitcoin, started creating Bitcoin bonds and doing all this stuff with Bitcoin. Now, they're using Algorand as a payments mechanism for their Bitcoin-centric economy.
From that, how has your work in Ukraine evolved? Most recently, we heard you're collaborating with banks and other partners to stand up something really exciting on a national level.
Yeah, I think it's been great because we initially started working with them to pilot, which is sort of a version of the digital hryvnia that they could put on chain and they could see how that worked. That was the first thing we then worked with them to deliver aid through the UNHCR. And now we're working with them on this transparency payment network that they're developing there. And this is a consortium of banks and a digital provider that have come together to be able to provide instant payments on chain. Again, that's with peer-to-peer, but also to merchants. When you get merchants involved, it makes it so that there's no need to cash out ever. And you can just use and buy the resources that you need using that. And with all this, the reformation and all the money coming in to be able to create and develop Ukraine again once the war is over, this is going to be a really important part. And one of the things why Zelensky wanted a cashless society is the idea, and this is one of the reasons why the UNHCR really likes the blockchain too, it's an immutable public record. It eliminates fraud, makes it very simple, it's very transparent. Anybody can check to see where the value is being transferred, and that is huge for everywhere, but particularly I think Zelensky thought in Ukraine.
In an interesting turn of events, the Stellar blockchain network is now playing a key role in Ukraine's digital currency landscape. According to Daniel Dixon, the pilot program began with Ukraine putting its national currency on the Stellar blockchain, effectively creating a central bank digital currency, or CBDC. Dixon went on to explain that the consortium of banks has jumped on board with this initiative. Now, here's where it gets intriguing. Some of these may not be household names, but a few are, including Credit Agricole, which is a fun fact, a RippleNet partner. Citibank is also in the mix, and while they haven't been making much noise about it, Ripple has. They've been talking about some of the friction that they've had with Citibank, and Citibank's always keeping things interesting. They're one of the correspondent banks. They debanked Brad Garlickhouse, as well as once Ripple bought Medico, Citibank just backed right out. So it's very interesting that the Stellar and Citibank are now working together in the Ukraine. So meanwhile, the U.S. is busy printing money and lending it to the Ukraine. Emphasis on lending. Historically, they just bundle up piles of cash and ship it over to the Ukraine. Who doesn't love a good old-fashioned cash pile? But this time with Stellar blockchain, there's transparency. And this is why the UN is very excited to see Stellar take on this initiative.
Secretary Janet Yellen says Russia will pay for its illegal war in Ukraine instead of Western taxpayers. The G7, a group of wealthy nations, is offering Ukraine a $50 billion loan backed by interest from Russia's frozen assets. President Biden confirmed that the U.S. will cover $20 billion of the loan, which will be repaid using interest on these assets. He emphasized that Ukraine will get the help it needs without burdening taxpayers while making sure Russia faces the consequences of its action. The G7 imposed heavy sanctions on Russia after its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, freezing about $280 billion worth of Russian assets. Yellen said the loan, available by year-end, will further punish Russia and send a clear message to Putin that waiting out Western support is futile. Ukraine's finance minister Sergei Marchenko praised the decision and urged for the outright seizure of Russian assets, thanking Yellen for her efforts in securing the fund.
The U.S. freezing the Russian central bank's assets and redistributing them to the countries they're at war with, well, let's be honest, that's a form of theft. Now, I'm not saying I support Russia's action in Ukraine, but meddling with the global economy like this is a slippery slope, and a laissez-faire approach is the way to go. Because any interference, whether it's sanctions, trade embargoes, or anything that disrupts free markets, is negative and will eventually backfire. This is why BRICS is expanding like wildfire. They're building their own system like a new SWIFT alternative to protect themselves from this type of economic strong-arming we're seeing. It's no surprise, gold and Bitcoin are at all-time highs. This is a new line that we have crossed, and we don't know the consequences of this yet, and we are witnessing history, but few understand.
You end up with a chart that shows you that, yes, all this is happening within, let's call them BRICS, even though Saudi Arabia hates Iran and there's no BRICS friendship there. You know, Iran just recently let it be known if their oil gets blown up, they'll blow up Saudi's oil. So like they're not friends, right? But within the BRICS camp, that's all swapping around, right? And trade's going up all the time. But if you look at how much trade as a group they do with the OECD, so into the West, into Europe and into America in particular, it dwarfs it, and it's still accelerating into the OECD. So the day on which China finally says, right, this is working, this system you're describing, we're going to push it past a certain threshold, and Trump or Harris may have different tolerances for that threshold to bring it back to the election. They lose everything going into the US, and suddenly all the support for tens of millions of workers who make widgets which go to Europe or America disappear. And they have to find someone in the BRICS who can buy a staggering amount of product. And this is for an economy in China which won't inflate its own consumer demand.
That's what the gold's for, though. As they're inflating their gold, they've been encouraging the Chinese people to buy lots of gold since 2002. State media. The gold goes up in that scenario. Gold explodes higher because the other side of the coin to what you just described, yes, I agree, it's going to be very deflationary for the BRICS. It is going to be hyperinflationary for the West. Think about what you just said. We're going to cut off all the stuff from China. Shelves go empty in the West. The bond market collapses. The Fed prints it to keep financing the government. Gold goes to the moon. So now when gold goes to the moon, in the BRICS, we've got how much gold did Chinese people own? Or number one, and then how many do the Indians own? You're going to create a consumer class overnight.
I understand the vision, but just to retort quickly, it's not that it can't happen. That is a possible future. But what did the Fed do with gold in the 30s? Just confiscated it. All it would take in that kind of environment, which would be a war-like environment, would be one step away from global war were that to happen, because it would be 2008, but with guns loaded on all sides, is to say no one does any business with them. You get arrested if we see any of you doing it. And we're doing massive fiat to immediately, within our group of producing countries, set up factories for everything. We're going to have a really crappy 3 or 4 years, or 2 or 3 years, depending on how much groundwork we've done building up to it. But on the other side, there's a hard break. You've got your shiny gold medal over there. It's illegal here. Internationally, nothing comes in or goes out of a port. You're going to have to be smuggling things in, like, medieval style again, on little boats to try and
like
get any television sets.
Yeah,
Intriguing financial move. China has reportedly printed 10 trillion yen, equivalent to about $1.64 trillion. That's a serious injection of liquidity into their economy. But what's even more surprising is the Chinese authorities are encouraging their citizens to move away from their national currency and instead invest in hard assets like gold. It's almost as if they're saying, hey, maybe don't trust this system too much, buy something that's real. Not exactly what you'd expect from a country's leadership, right? It's as if they're subtly acknowledging the limitations of the currency and positioning themselves for what's next to come. On the other side of the Pacific, former President Donald Trump has vowed to raise tariffs 400% if needed. As the world moves from a unipolar to a multipolar structure, the West and East are increasingly breaking off into their own spheres of influence. We're going to need systems that cannot be easily corrupted, altered, sanctioned. What we need are honest, trustless systems to bridge economies together. This is no small feat. It's all major undertaking that could reshape how global trade and finance operates. The real life begins as soon as you leave your house. Thanks everyone, I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon or my ghost site, dmjr.ghost.io.